We're actually going to come from Luke. Luke's account of the crucifixion and the resurrection. And there's just always on today, Easter Sunday, resurrection, I call it resurrection celebration. Because throughout the year we celebrate different significant historical figures. The day that they died, we mourn the day that they died. And we remember their contributions to society, what they did for this people, what they did for a cause. But when we celebrate Jesus, it's really safe to say that we do celebrate his death because he didn't stay there. We celebrate his death because it was necessary, but it wasn't final, it wasn't permanent. We celebrate his death because 3 days later it was followed by a resurrection. A grand and glorious resurrection that wasn't celebrated with crowds and throngs of people. It wasn't celebrated with a dinner. It wasn't celebrated with cake and punch. It wasn't celebrated like that. But we remember it. When we remember it, it should be a celebratory manner. Amen. Now, as we think about the full crucifixion experience, culminating in the resurrection and ultimately the ascension of Christ into heaven, we know that those events happen. We see them written in the Word, and there's other secular historical writings that back up and confirm the fact that Jesus was crucified, that there was an empty tomb, and that there was a search for the body. But we know that as he went through all of that, it didn't happen in a bubble. It didn't happen in a vacuum. But there were other people that were impacted and affected even as the crucifixion process was taking place. From the Garden of Gethsemane, the bystanders, the crowd that came to take Jesus, the gentleman whose ear was cut off and then healed by Jesus. If it wasn't Jesus' purpose to come and die on the cross, that gentleman would never have had that experience. But what I want to do today is we just kind of look through the timeline of the crucifixion, culminating in the resurrection, followed by the ascension. We're just going to kind of take snapshots in certain spots of certain people, of people along the timeline, and just think about how they were affected by the crucifixion experience. If we comb through all 4 chapters, all 4 Gospels, we could pick out quite a few. But just in Luke, I want to touch on the ones that stood out to me as I was meditating, as I was reading through it this week. I'm going to start with Peter. That's chapter 22, verses 54 through 62. And I'm going to read through those. Luke chapter 22, verses 54 through 62. And it says, and they took him and led him and brought him into the high priest's house. And Peter followed afar off. And then, and when they had kindled a fire in the midst of the hall, and they were sat down together, Peter sat down among them. But a certain maid beheld him as they sat by the fire, and earnestly looked upon him, and said, this man was also with him. And he denied him, saying, woman, I know him not. And after a little while, another saw him, and said, thou art also of them. And Peter said, man, I am not. And about the space of 1 hour, after another confidently affirmed, saying, of a truth, this fellow also was with him, for he is a Galilean. And Peter said, man, I know not what thou sayest. And immediately, while he yet spake, the cock crew, and the Lord turned and looked upon Peter. And Peter remembered the word of the Lord, how he had said unto him, before the cock crow, thou shalt deny me thrice. And Peter went out, and he wept bitterly. So, the crucifixion experience for Christ, as he came and he was put through all of the things that he went through for each and every one of us, so that his death, burial, resurrection, and ascension into heaven would bring us out of condemnation into salvation, put us in a spot where we were separated from God as far as we could possibly be in a spiritual sense, now into a relationship with him as adopted sons. As adopted sons. And through all of that, in this snapshot of what had to happen, Peter's experience. Now, if we go back to where Jesus predicts Peter's denial, even before he tells Peter that you will deny me 3 times, he says, Simon, Simon, he's going back to Simon, Satan has desired to sift you, but I have prayed for you. And then he goes back and says, and after you've been restored, strengthen the brethren. Thank you for help. Amen. Satan has desired to sift you as wheat. But I have prayed for thee that thy faith not fail. That thy faith not fail. He says, he didn't say, Peter, I've prayed for you that you wouldn't make a mistake. He didn't say, Peter, I pray for you that you that you wouldn't deny me. I didn't pray that you would go through this without making a mistake, without making an error, without doing something that's going to cause harm or discomfort in your life. He says, I pray that your faith not fail. Because Satan has desired to sift you. When you sift something, there's a shaking that takes place and a kind of a tossing. There's a sifter, when you sift flour, it's got the little screen thing, you pour it in there, you got to beat it around, and you tap it lightly, But that's what we're talking about, a sifting. There's a shaking. When you sift wheat, say that's the whole thing. On the threshing floor, you're sifting the wheat. It gets tossed in the wind. It gets shaken, and it gets tossed in the wind some more. Satan is desiring to sift Peter. He wants to throw Peter up in the wind and that he be shaken and blown to separate him, try to separate him, because that's why you separate the wheat. That's why you sift the wheat, because you want to separate the good from the bad. Jesus didn't say, I prayed, but I've prayed that you not go through this. I've prayed that as you go through this, when you go through this, that your faith not fail.
Thank you, Jesus.
So he's setting Peter up. Now, and Peter said, I'm ready to go with thee, Lord, both into prison and in death. See, Peter didn't think about this. He didn't ponder what Jesus was saying. He heard it, but he was thinking in himself, no. So what? I'm ready. I'm ready. I can handle this. I'm ready. And Jesus, now we get into it. Jesus is, I tell thee, Peter, the cock shall not crow this day before thou shalt thrice deny me. Before you deny me 3 times, you will deny me 3 times before the cock crows, before the rooster cock-a-doodle-doos. So Peter's whole thing was that as the crucifixion is going on, Jesus has been taken, and he's now being, the religious leaders, they have him and they're questioning him and everything else. And Peter is following. He's not hiding like the other 10. He's not hiding, but he's following. But this is his sifting process. This is his sifting process. Satan has desired to sift you. So the crucifixion process, the crucifixion leading to the resurrection, followed by the ascension, was part of Peter's sifting process. So the crucifixion, Jesus coming and dying on the cross, wasn't just about Jesus dying on the cross. It was about Peter and having to prepare Peter for what Peter would be called to do. So, yes, the crucifixion was about Peter and him receiving Jesus, but it was also about Peter's preparation. It was also about Peter's sifting. Satan desired to sift, and God said, go ahead, sift away. But when it's all said and done, Peter's going to work for me, not you. Peter's going to be strengthened and prepared to work for me and not you. All you are, son, is part of the process. All you are is, see, again, Romans 8:28 hasn't been written yet. But God already knows because he is. But God already knows what's going to happen. He already knows because it's part of his plan. Satan desired to do, but it was already part of God's plan to strengthen Peter. Because Peter needed to go through this. Peter needed to have all of this experience in order to be able to preach what he preached to the people whom he preached it to. In the time that he preached it, he needed to go through all of this. Satan had a time. He had his own plan. Jesus did not say, get thee behind me, Satan. Go get your hands off my people, Satan. But I have prayed for you that your faith not fail. That's why Peter had to experience what he experienced. So the crucifixion experience was about getting Christ to the cross so that he could die, so he could be resurrected, so he could be ascended into heaven. But the crucifixion experience was also about Peter being prepared for what Peter had to do. The crucifixion had to take place so that Peter could be prepared, be sifted. Amen. And just quickly, just briefly, other people that were impacted. Chapter 23. Chapter 23 and verse 12. I want to read 11 and 12. It says, and Herod, with his men of war, set him at naught, and mocked him, and arrayed him in a gorgeous robe, and sent him again to Pilate. Herod sent Jesus to Pilate. The soldiers, they dressed him up, and they mocked him, and they sent him back to Pilate. And the same day, Pilate and Herod were friends together, for before they were at enmity between themselves. Herod, the Jewish leader in the prefecture, who was under Pontius Pilate, who was the Roman leader, they were at odds with one another. They were at enmity with one another. They didn't like each other. There was no friendship. There was no bond. There was no camaraderie. There was no closeness. There was no tight-knitness between the two. But now, because God had so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in him shall not perish, but have everlasting life. But in that, these two men who had enmity between them, in Jesus being presented before them, now they're friends. Now they're friends. What's the significance of that? Is that you had a Hebrew, the Jewish leader, and the Roman leader who were at odds with one another. But now, because Jesus came through, Jesus on his way to the cross, carrying out what it is God had for him, that two people, quote unquote, that were working against him, even though Pilate tried not to, but in Christ carrying out what he needed to do, those working against him became friends. Where they were against one another when Christ came along, now they're friends. And it's not saying, oh, Christ came along and brought beautiful unity between the... No. When the gospel comes along and the truth comes in, those who are against each other, because the truth is what the truth is, now they're going to unite. Remember back in Deuteronomy, your enemies, they will unite and come at you one way. But when they see God on your side, they will flee 7 ways. These two were against one another, but when the truth came along, Christ came along, now they're united. So yeah, as a believer, as Christ experienced in his crucifixion experience, that the enemies will unite to try to join their forces against. So don't be surprised. So don't be surprised as we go through our hard times, as we go through our difficult time, just as the crucifixion leading to the resurrection, followed by the ascension, was so that whosoever believes shall not perish, but have everlasting life. But even the enemies of the gospel, will find common ground against the gospel. They will put aside their differences to unite against the gospel. So Peter was prepared. Pilate and Herod, the enemies of the gospel, they were united. Let's stay in chapter 23, and let's go to chapter 23, verses 55 and 56. This is, and the women also, which came from Galilee, followed after and beheld the sepulchre and how his body was laid. And they returned and prepared spices and ornaments. and rested the Sabbath day according to the commandment. So they followed Christ, whereas the disciples felt a threat in the garden when Jesus was taken. They ran and hid. So you have the 10 that were hiding, Peter following, yet denying, as Christ even predicted, as part of his sifting, yet preparation for what it was that he had. The women who followed Christ there was no threat to their lives. They weren't seen as the disciples, the men. The disciples were seen as part of the threat of the gospel, but they were equally as important because they followed Christ, because they were there. In fact, the angel at the grave had to send the woman, had to send Mary to tell the disciples. So the women who followed, the women who saw, who experienced, and these, see, Mary Magdalene, whom Jesus had cast demons out of. Mary, the mother of James and John, the mothers, the women, in their servanthood to Christ, watched all of this go down, saw everything go down. Their faith was tested. When we said we celebrate the resurrection because we know that he's alive. They heard Jesus say that I'm going to die. I won't be betrayed into the hands, but I will rise again. But I will not stay dead. But I will come back. But I will rise again. But after they maintained the tradition that after 3 days the body had to be prepared. That after death the body had to be prepared for the grave. So they came. Did I just lose it that fast? 55 or 56. There it is. And they returned and prepared spices and ornaments and rested the Sabbath day according to the commandment. Whereas we celebrated the resurrection, they had not yet experienced the resurrection. Everything that they saw and everything that they went through watching Jesus, following Jesus through the crucifixion, and how it must have looked and appeared to them, there was no celebration in their hearts yet. There was no jubilance yet. There was no rejoicing yet, because they had not yet experienced the crucifixion. Even though it had been spoken, even though Jesus didn't tell them that I'm going to be in there 3 days and then y'all need to come. Y'all going to come anyway. Don't bother coming with the ornaments, the ointments and the spices and everything to prepare my body because I'm not going to be there. He did not tell them that. He went to the cross. He gave up the ghost and his body was taken down. And Joseph of Arimathea went and asked for the body and put it in his newly bought grave that was hewn out of stone. And he put Jesus in there and he closed it. But the women, in their grief over having watched Jesus die, their grief over having lost their Savior, the one lost him from this earth, as far as they knew. The emotion of the moment, which was not inappropriate, because God created us. He gave us these emotions. We're created in his image. Every emotion that we have is rightful. or expecting. But in that moment, when they saw what they saw, everything that they saw, their thoughts did not go back to what Jesus said. Their thoughts remained on what they saw. Understandable. Understandable, because it was a horrific thing to watch and experience. Because it didn't just happen in a moment. Because they watched him falsely accused. They watched him tried and convicted. They saw him carry the cross. They saw him nailed to the cross. They saw him up there for the entire time. And then they watched as he spoke his last. They watched as he breathed his last. And they watched as they took the body down, placed him in the grave. And that was what that was the last image that they had. That was the last thing. Their thoughts did not go back to the fact that he said he would rise again. But what they saw, what they experienced, prevented them from being able to go there. Our take from that is, don't get caught in what it looks like right now. Don't get caught in what it feels like right now. Let what it looks like, let what it feels like, let what it appears like take us back to what we know God said. Let it take us back, because therein is our peace and therein is our comfort. Therein is our comfort. They rightly grieved the loss of the Savior. They followed the tradition. They followed the tradition. But for us, that's our lesson. To don't stay in that moment. Don't stay in that moment. Don't let the tradition would be, I would say, compared today, would be like what the world would tell us is okay as far as our emotions. Yes, we have our emotions. Yes, we're going to experience those emotions. But our emotions should push us, turn us to God, the creator of them. Always go back to the creator. Always go back to the Heavenly Father. We're going to experience our emotions. They're in there for a reason. But God had to have put them in there for them to push us or pull us, lead us unto God. Whatever we're experiencing. Happiness ought to turn us to God. Our fear ought to turn us to God. Our sadness ought to turn us to God. Our anger ought to turn us to God. And there's a bunch more emotions out there. But they all ought to turn us to God. So that he can help us keep the right perspective on it. Because even, I was like, even happiness, that's a good thing, right? That's a good thing. We shouldn't have to turn to God when we're happy. Oh, you better. Oh, you better. Because whatever it is that made you so happy, you're going to want to stay happy. So you're going to want to stay in that thing so that you can stay happy all the time. And when that happy, whatever that thing was that made you happy is not there, you're going to be pursuing that happy thing instead of the one who allowed you to experience that happy thing.
Wow. Thank you.
So the broad range of our emotions ought to turn us to God. Our emotions ought to turn us to God. So, I'm not saying by any stretch that the women who follow Christ and were doing that, there was no sin, there was no out of line. They weren't out of line in what they were doing. They were simply doing what they knew to do. by tradition as far as preparation of the body. But in that account, any of throughout the Gospels where it talks about the women in their preparation, it doesn't mention that how they went back to and thought about what Jesus said. They just did it. So that's the women. But we know again that the crucifixion, all the different things, all the different people who watched, who saw, who experienced these different things during the process, during the time frame of the crucifixion. Think about now the two thieves. The two thieves. And that's in chapter 23, verses 39 through 43. And one of the malefactors, thieves, wrongdoers, which were hanged, railed on him, saying, "If thou be the Christ, save thyself and us." But the other answering rebuked him, saying, "Dost thou not fear God, seeing that thou art in the same condemnation? And we indeed justly, for we receive the due reward of our deeds, but this man hath done nothing amiss." And he said unto Jesus, "Lord, remember me when thou comest into thy kingdom." And Jesus said unto him, Verily, verily, I say unto thee, today thou shalt be with me in paradise. Oh, there's so much in that right there. The two malefactors, they're thieves. They've been hung right next to Jesus. They've been hung in the same manner as Jesus. But they didn't go through what Jesus went through. They weren't taken aside. They weren't scourged before they got crucified. They weren't taken aside after being scourged. They weren't taken aside by the guards and a crown of thorns put on their head and wrapped in a purple robe and then made fun of and mocked. That didn't happen to the thieves. That didn't happen to them. They may have had to carry their own cross. Okay, but no insults were being hurled at them. They were thieves. They were caught. They were convicted. They were wrong. But because Adam sinned in the garden and God needed a way to bring mankind back into relationship with him, he sent Jesus to die on the cross. These two thieves who committed their crime were caught, tried, convicted, and now in the execution of their sentence of death on the cross, just happened to have that being carried out on the same day that Jesus is going to the cross. So in Matthew, in another account in the gospel, it says where both of them were railing against it. Both of them had something to say about Christ. Imagine you're Christ on the cross. You've gone through everything on the way there, which is way, way more than what these two guys hanging next to you on either side are went through. But they're nailed to a cross also. And they can muster their strength to be railing against him. Everything that the crowd is saying, these two convicted thief crooks, not even good ones because they got caught, can muster their strength to rail against him like the crowd down there is doing. And they're guilty. And they're guilty. But something had to happen for one of them to come to a realization. Something had to happen. Go up to verse 34 real fast. No, let's go to 32. Chapter 23. And there were also two others, malefactors, led with him to be put to death. And when they were come to the place which is called Calvary, there they crucified him, Jesus, and the malefactors, one on the right hand and the other on the left. Verse 34, then Jesus said, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. There you go. On the cross, having endured everything that he's endured up to this moment, Jesus says aloud, he didn't think it, red letters here, this is not his thoughts, these are his words. Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. Had to have been audible. Again, it's in red letters, so it proceeded from his lips. Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. He is nailed to the cross. He has been through everything that he has been through. Beard pulled, spat upon, face slapped, the crown of thorns, being mocked by soldiers, being lied upon, falsely accused, going through all of this, not even having ever committed a sin in his earthly life. Ever. But in the midst of all of this, he's able to utter the words, Father, left side, railing on him, right side, railing on him. They're using their strength to get at him. But he musters his strength to say, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. Oh, my. The power of the words that had to have come out of his mouth. Back to verse 39. And one of the malefactors which were hanged railed on him, saying, If thou be Christ, save thyself and us. Now, listen to what he says. If thou be Christ, save thyself and us. They're down there, these people are down there, they're not under any duress. They're just making fun. Oh, save yourself. You say you're the Christ, save yourself. Crook. I will put him on the left side. I'm going to say the one on the left. And the significance of that is because in heaven, the sheep go to the right. Goats go to the left. So I'm just going to say, I don't know this for a historical fact, but I'm just going to say, left crook, okay, is railing on him. Got something to say. Still got something to say. Right crook, and I'm sure that if he said it, because he said it, Father, forgive them, they know not what they, both of them heard him. Both of them heard him. But left crook didn't touch his heart, didn't change his heart. If you're the Christ, then save yourself and us. Get us off these crosses. So he's making fun, but he's also trying to play both sides of the fence. If you're Christ, remember the scene in the Disney Aladdin, the animated Aladdin, when Aladdin's in the cave, he tries to steal the lamp, cave closes in, and they're trapped. And the genie says you get 3 wishes, and Aladdin tricked him into getting them out of there. And the genie says you got 2 wishes left. And Aladdin's like, no, I didn't wish you to get us out of there. You got us out. And the genie's like, okay, you got me. He's trying to play the genie trick on Jesus. If you are Christ, save yourself and us. But Jesus knew. Jesus knows who he is. If he didn't know who he was, if he wasn't able to stand on, this is my son with whom I'm well pleased, if he wasn't able to stand on that in that moment, then being hung on the cross, having all of that humiliation heaped upon him with crowds and crowds and crowds, he just mocking him and making fun of him, 2 crucified thieves making fun of him, he would have come down off that cross if he didn't know who he was. He would have come down off that cross. Oh, you want me to show you who I am? You want me to prove who I am? You don't want that? Oh, no, we did not want that. You don't want that. But because he knew who he was, because he knew who he was. And he had just said, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. He knew who he was, he knew whose he was, and he remembered his purpose. Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. And so, right crook, right thief, says, dost thou fear God? Dost not thou fear God, seeing that thou art in the same condemnation? He's had a heart change. He's had a revelation. He heard the declaration. He heard it. Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. Do not, seeing that we are in the same condemnation, we're going to die today. We're not coming down off these crosses breathing. We're going to breathe our last up here. Indeed, and we indeed justly. He said, we deserve what we're getting. We deserve what we're getting. The due reward for our deeds. Do you think the due reward for our deeds? The due reward for our deeds. It's not a coincidence that, okay, one of the gospel writers, is this not like one of the gospel writers, but the word says, for the wages of sin is death. Romans, there it is, Romans 6:23 or 3:23, one of those two. But the wages of sin is death. You earn your wages. He's saying the due reward for our deeds. So he's saying we've earned what we're getting. It's Romans 6:23, for the wages of sin is death, but the gift of God. So he's living out Romans right here again. He says, but this man has done nothing amiss. This thief on the cross can see that Jesus is innocent, can see that he does not deserve what he's getting. Do you think that somehow he recognized the fact that they overdid everything in the crucifixion? The crown of thorns, the mocking, the spitting, and all of that other stuff? Do you think that after Jesus says, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do, and then he's seeing all this other extra stuff that's happening because he's a guilty crook. He's on the cross for what he did. Nobody's mocking him. Nobody's mocking him. In fact, if they weren't there to mock and get at Jesus the way they were, there would hardly be anybody there. There would be spectators. They would be curious, the looky-loos, because crucifixion was a big thing, and it was done in public. But they wouldn't have nearly the crowd, and the crowd wouldn't be behaving in that manner towards them. But because Jesus is up there, do you think some of that might have sunk into this thief? But this man has done nothing amiss. Then he says, Lord, remember me when thou comest into thy kingdom. Lord, remember me when thou comest into thy kingdom. Crook, left crook, if thou be Christ, save thyself and us. Right thief, Lord, remember me when thou comest into thy kingdom. He could see by Jesus' confession, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. The fact that they were mocking him as king, that this must have been a king. What the world rails against you for being, they're going to rail against you for being what you are. For being what you are. That's why they're so quick to respond and react when they see a Christian fall, when they see a Christian sin. Oh, you're supposed to be righteous. Oh, you're supposed to be. You're right. You're right. But here's the answer. But God. Here's the answer. But Jesus died so that I could fall and get back up. Jesus came down and went down into the grave and came back up so that I here on earth could fall, scrape my knee, and get back up. It's all about a down and up process. It's all about a down and up process. It's about a down to be up process. Down on my knees, worshiping God. Down on my knees, asking forgiveness so that he can exalt me, so that he can lift me up. Down on my knees in humility. Down on my knees, humble and meek, so that he can lift me up. The down to up process. The down to up process. So that was the experience of the thieves on the cross. Because Adam sinned and God needed redemption for men. These two thieves on the cross were affected by Jesus' crucifixion. Finally, the centurion soldiers. The centurion soldiers who crucified and then mocked Jesus. Not chapter 27, but chapter 22. Verses 35 and 36. 22. No.
That's 23, 45 through 47. 23.
Yes. And it's 20. Yeah, 26. Okay, here it is. Okay, sorry. Matthew chapter 27. Sorry about that. My notes aren't. They let me down here. No, they didn't. Here, Matthew chapter 27. Sorry. Matthew chapter 27, verses 35 and 36. And they crucified him and parted his garments, casting lots, that it might be fulfilled, which was spoken by the prophet. They parted my garments among them, and upon my vesture did they cast lots. And sitting down, they watched him there. These are the ones who crucified him. These are the ones who nailed him to the cross. They had to lay, the cross was laid down. It was nailed together. He was put on that cross. He was nailed to that cross. That cross was put down into the ground. Same ones that put the crown of thorns on his head, mocked him with a purple robe around. They crucified him. They put him there, and then they went and sat to watch him die. Went and sat to watch him die. I know in the movie The Passion of the Christ, they showed the guards, and that it was implied that some of them, had to drink alcohol, become somewhat inebriated to be able to carry out the horrific things that they carried out, and that's very possible because the gruesomeness of what Christ went through. The gruesomeness of the scourging, the gruesomeness of having to nail a person, a human being, to a cross, the gruesomeness of that. So people just cannot do in their right mind. So you have to, so they may have had to. But even in all of that, verse 36, and sitting down, they watched him there. So up over him on the cross was the sign mocking him. This is Jesus, the King of the Jews. The sign mocking him for who he was. Which may have had something to do with the right thief being able to recognize who Jesus was. But here the soldiers are, and they crucified him. And in verses 37 through 53, still more mocking. The two thieves mocking him. Verse 46, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? That was the very moment that Christ was hoping to avoid in the garden. God having to turn his back on him. That, the ultimate lonely moment for our Savior. In that moment, every sin from Adam until his triumphant return was upon him. And God had to turn his back. And even though Jesus knew that, the pain of it, the experience of it, one that we will never know, had to cry out, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? And in that moment, verse 50, Jesus, when he had cried again with a loud voice, yielded up the ghost, breathed his last. He gave up the ghost. He was no longer alive. And behold, the veil of the temple was rent, verse 51, rent in twain from top to bottom, and the earth did quake, and rocks did rent. Rocks were torn. They fell apart. And the graves were opened, and many bodies of the saints which slept arose and came out of the grave. And after his resurrection, and came out of the graves after his resurrection, and went into the holy city and appeared unto many. Verse 54. Now the centurion and they that were with him, watching Jesus, same ones from verse 35 and 36, the mockers, the crucifiers, who sat down now to watch the rest of the show, to watch the culmination of their work, to watch him die. After what they watched him die, but then they saw all of this happen after he died, after he gave up the ghost. Now the centurion and they that were with him, watching Jesus, saw the earthquake and those things that were done, and they feared greatly, saying, truly this was the Son of God. Truly this was the Son of God. The same ones, very same ones that crucified him, they parted his garments and they cast lots that it might be fulfilled. They made fun of him, they mocked him, they put a crown of thorns on him, they did everything, they nailed him to the very cross. And then they stayed to watch the rest of the show. They stayed to watch the completion and the fulfillment of their work, not knowing that all they were doing was carrying out God's plan. What they thought was them doing their worst was simply carrying out God's plan. Yes, it was horrific. Yes, it was gruesome, but it had to be done so that we could be brought back into relationship. So if you think about the gruesomeness and the horrificness of everything that Jesus went through for us to be restored unto man, think about how horrific and gruesome it was to God that Adam sinned in the first place. Jesus' death had to outweigh the gruesomeness and horrificness of the garden. It had to. It had to. See, our restoration unto God had to be more than an anointing. It had to be more than a pronunciation. It had to be more than that. Because the separation. Listen to what happened when Jesus gave up the ghost. It says, and the veil of the temple was rent twain from top to bottom. The veil was torn, a tearing. The earth did quake, and rocks rent, rocks tore. In the garden, when Adam sinned, the relationship was torn. The relationship was ruptured. The relationship was broken. And when Christ gave up the ghost, The veil that had to be placed between God and man, because the relationship was torn, and the veil had to be established because we could no longer experience God's presence like that, had to be torn. Rocks had to be rent. Rocks representing the old foundation. Rocks representing all the old things that all the tradition, all of that was built on had to be rent and torn. And now the centurion and they that were watching with him, all of them, they saw everything that happened, all those things that were done, and they feared greatly, saying, "This was truly the Son of God." So way back in the garden when Adam sinned, and God said, "I have this beginning of my redemption plan." And Christ had to endure everything that he endured, so that his crucifiers, so that the least likely people to believe that he was who he was would have to, after seeing everything, make a declaration: truly this was the Son of God. So Peter could be prepared for what he had to do. Our warning that even our worst enemies will unite themselves against us, against the cause of the gospel. The women who followed Jesus, the thieves on the cross, the one repentant thief, the centurions, the crucifixion. The crucifixion had to take place so that each one would have their opportunity, so that each one is now accountable for what they saw and how they responded to the truth of the gospel being played out before them. Christ endured all of that so that they could watch and decide how they're going to respond. Because each one stand before the Lord, Father and Heavenly Father, righteous judge is going to say, "Why did you receive my son? Why did you receive my son?" And there will be no excuses. Well, they made me crucify him. Why did you receive him? I can forgive you driving nails in his hands. Why did you receive him? I can't get past that. I won't get past that. I can get past you driving a crown of thorns on his head. I can get past you pulling his beard. I can get past you. I can forgive you spitting in his face. I can forgive you mocking him. But I can make no concession for not receiving him. But Pilate said, "Why didn't you receive him? Why didn't you receive him?" But Herod said, but Caiaphas said, but the religious leaders said, "Why didn't you receive him? Why didn't you receive him?" That's the whole reason. That's the whole reason we gather to worship. That's the whole reason that Jesus gave his final command: "Go ye into the world and make disciples of all nations," to give them an opportunity to receive him. That's our job. That's why he came to die. Because once we receive, we would become ambassadors. That once we receive, we would become carriers of the good news But everything that we go through in our life, everything that we experience, just like Christ in the crucifixion, everything gives others the opportunity. Gives others the opportunity. Because if Christ never came and was crucified, those centurions would have never seen. The thieves on the cross, the right thief, would never have made it. Peter wouldn't have been prepared to do what it is that he needed to do. He would never have had that purpose. So that's what our takeaway is from this. That even when we're going through our hardest time, and we know this, it's as much for others as it is for us. It's as much for others who encounter us along the way, and it's as much for others who will hear the story and the testimony. Just like Christ, as he was going through the crucifixion from the garden to the resurrection, many lives were touched, many people had opportunity to see and receive. And now that he's in heaven sitting at the right side, hearing the story, believers are encouraged, and the lost are encouraged to receive, are given opportunity to receive. As we go through our crucifixion time, the way Christ went through his, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do, touch the heart of a thief, of a crucified thief on a cross. How we go through what we go through gives others opportunity to believe. Gives others opportunity to believe. That's the why, sometimes, to our suffering, so that others will have opportunity. So that others will have opportunity. It's going to strengthen us, because in the end, when he ascended into heaven, name above all names. Name above all names. We, because of that, as believers, have received, he knows our name. Our names are written in the Lamb's Book of Life. Because he knows our name. He knows our name. We have to know who we are. Amen. Happy resurrection celebration.